Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, ready to dive deep into a really pivotal chapter of the civil rights movement.
Hey.
The Freedom Rides of 1961. We're going to explore firsthand accounts, different historical perspectives, and really get a sense of what it was like to be on those front lines of this fight for equality.
And what I think is really interesting here is that we're going to be looking at not just the events themselves, but the strategic thinking behind those events. We're talking about the Congress of Racial Equality, a CORE, a group that used nonviolent direct action to challenge segregation in interstate travel. They chose to create a crisis, a tactic designed to force the government's hand.
So let's set the stage. It's 1961. Segregation is still very deeply embedded in the South, even despite Supreme Court rulings that declared it unconstitutional. Why was that the case?
Well, you have to remember that legal rulings don't always immediately translate into social change. There were massive social and political forces resisting integration. Many southern states simply ignored or found ways around federal law. The reality on the ground was very different from what was on the law books.
Right. And into this powder keg steps CORE, determined to expose that reality and force change. Their strategy was risky, almost audacious, you could say.
Absolutely. They knew they were putting themselves in harm's way, but they believed that the potential impact outweighed the risks. They wanted to show the nation and the world the truth about segregation, hoping to create a moral crisis that the federal government could no longer ignore.
And to really understand the human side of this story, we're going to hear directly from the writers themselves. We have accounts from Charles Person, a Black student who was swept up in the wave of activism on college campuses at the time.
And Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, a white student at Duke University who felt a moral calling to join the fight for justice. Her faith played a big part in that decision. Hearing those voices, I think, will really give you a sense of what motivated these individuals.
Yeah, what really struck me was the story of Albert Gordon, a Holocaust survivor who saw parallels between Nazi Germany and the racism that he was seeing in America.
You know, his participation speaks volumes about the universality of the fight for human rights. It highlights how injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Now, these freedom rides, they started peacefully enough, but things took a dark turn once those rides reached the Deep South.
In Anniston, Alabama, a mob attacked one of the buses, firebombing it. The riders barely escaped with their lives.
It's hard to even imagine the terror.
And then in Birmingham, Alabama, the police, under the notorious Bull Connor, stood by and watched as another mob brutally attacked the riders.
The images of this violence captured on film shocked the nation, and it became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement.
A horrific display of the entrenched racism and violence that permeated parts of the South.
This violence, broadcasted for all to see, ultimately forced the Kennedy administration to act. Attorney General Robert Kennedy pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission to finally enforce desegregation on interstate travel.
It was a significant victory for the movement, but it also revealed some of the tensions within the civil rights movement itself.
For example, CORE felt overshadowed by groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. SCLC, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they felt like they weren't receiving the recognition they deserved for initiating the Freedom Rides.
And this wasn't just about hurt feelings. It had real consequences. Feeling overlooked could affect their ability to secure funding, recruit volunteers, and shape the broader narrative of the movement.
So even as they were celebrating this victory, there was a sense of frustration and resentment brewing within CORE.
Exactly. And this feeling of being overshadowed would contribute to some of the strategic debates within CORE about the future direction of the movement.
These internal debates were about more than just recognition, though. They were about tactics and philosophy. For instance, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, favored a different approach. Their chief lawyer at the time, Thurgood Marshall, even criticized the Freedom Riders, calling them reckless.
The NAACP believed in chipping away at segregation through legal challenges, working within the system. They viewed CORE's direct action tactics as unnecessarily provocative and potentially counterproductive.
So you have these different factions within the civil rights movement, all united in the fight for racial equality, but disagreeing on the best path forward.
It's a reminder that social movements are rarely monolithic. They're often made up of diverse groups with varying perspectives, strategies, and sometimes conflicting priorities.
Yeah.
And those internal tensions can be just as important to understand as the external battles against injustice.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how these internal disagreements played out, like against this backdrop of the Cold War. The U.S. is presenting itself as this champion of freedom and democracy to the world. But the violence against the Freedom Riders just exposes this totally different reality.
You're absolutely right. These images of racial brutality broadcast globally really undermined America's image and gave ammunition to its Cold War rivals. This put immense pressure on the Kennedy administration, particularly Robert Kennedy, who was very aware of the international implications.
So he pushes for the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC,
Yeah.
to finally enforce these desegregation rules.
Exactly. And in November 1961, the ICC issued new regulations mandating the removal of all white and colored signs in interstate travel facilities, a direct result of the freedom rides and the public outcry they generated.
So CORE's strategy of creating a crisis worked. They forced the government's hand, achieved a tangible victory.
Yes. But it's important to remember that this victory came at a high cost to the riders themselves. They faced horrific violence, risked their lives.
And it also sparked some pretty intense debates within CORE itself. Some members, understandably shaken by the violence they had endured, began to question the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance.
Imagine being on that burning bus in Anniston, or facing a mob wielding baseball bats and iron pipes. It's not surprising that some within CORE began to argue for armed self-defense. They felt that turning the other cheek was no longer a viable option.
Right. How could they be expected to just endure that level of violence without protecting themselves?
It was a very complex and agonizing debate. On the one hand, you have this deeply held belief in nonviolence, a philosophy central to CORE's identity. On the other, you have the very real and immediate threat of violence, the trauma of what they'd experienced.
So how did CORE ultimately resolve this conflict?
CORE's leadership ultimately remained committed to nonviolence, believing that it was the most effective and morally sound way to achieve their goals. They argued that meeting violence with violence would only escalate the situation and play into the hands of their oppressors. They believed that maintaining a moral high ground was crucial to winning over public opinion and achieving lasting change.
It must have been a difficult decision, weighing those principles of their movement against the dangers they faced.
Absolutely. It speaks to the courage and conviction of these activists. They understood that the fight for justice would be long and arduous, requiring immense sacrifice.
This commitment to nonviolence is really evident in the accounts of Charles Person and Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, two of the freedom riders whose stories we're exploring.
What struck me about their accounts was their unwavering commitment, even in the face of such terrifying experiences. Person talks about feeling a part of something larger than himself, a sense of purpose. And Mulholland's faith shines through, providing her with the strength.
It's incredibly inspiring. These were ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things.
They weren't politicians or celebrities. Students, activists, everyday folks who believed in a better future and were willing to put everything on the line. Their stories remind us that change often comes from the bottom up, from the courage and determination of regular people who refuse to accept injustice.
And their actions had a profound impact, forcing America to confront its own hypocrisy, prompting the federal government to finally enforce desegregation laws. But as we've seen, the freedom rides also expose those internal tensions, the competing strategies.
Yes, and these tensions often played out in the relationship between CORE and other prominent civil rights organizations, like Dr. King's SCLC.
We talked earlier about CORE feeling overshadowed by SCLC. Can you elaborate on why that was such a significant issue?
It wasn't just a matter of ego or wanting to be in the spotlight. Feeling overshadowed had real implications for CORE. Media coverage often focused on King and SCLC, gave them a larger platform.
So this disparity in media attention could have affected CORE's ability to raise funds, attract volunteers, ultimately achieve its goals.
Exactly. It made it harder for them to gain support, to shape the direction of the movement. And this feeling contributed to some of those strategic debates within CORE about how to proceed. Some members believed they needed to be more assertive, take more risks, to distinguish themselves.
And we also saw these strategic differences play out in the relationship between CORE and the NAACP. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP's lead lawyer, was very critical of the freedom rides, believed that they were reckless and counterproductive.
The NAACP, with its focus on legal battles and court victories, saw the freedom rides as unnecessarily provocative. They believed change should come through careful legal maneuvering, gradually dismantling segregation through the courts. They worried that CORE's direct action would alienate allies and set back integration.
It's interesting to see how these different perspectives within the civil rights movement reflect these broader debates about how to achieve social justice.
Absolutely. It highlights the complexity and dynamism of social movements. There are always internal disagreements, competing strategies, and evolving tactics as activists grapple with these challenging questions about how best to achieve their goals. And these internal debates are often just as crucial to understanding the trajectory of a movement as the external battles against injustice.
Yeah, it really challenges that idea that social movements are always so unified.
Right.
That everybody agrees on the best way to go about achieving those goals. Clearly, that wasn't the case with the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and I think that internal, diversity of thought is one of the things that makes the freedom rides so fascinating to study. It wasn't a simple, straightforward narrative. There were all these layers of strategy, sacrifice, deeply held convictions.
And there are different schools of thought that try to make sense of it all. Right?
Exactly. Historians have looked at the freedom rides through a variety of lenses, offering different perspectives on their significance and impact.
Okay, so walk me through some of those perspectives. Like, what are the main points of contention?
Okay, well, let's start with what we might call the traditionalist view. Historians like David Garrow see the freedom rides as this crucial turning point. They argue that the violence the riders endured was so shocking, so impossible to ignore, that it galvanized public opinion and forced the federal government to finally uphold the constitutional rights of Black Americans.
So they believe that the freedom rides played a key role in pushing the Kennedy administration to act on desegregation.
Yes, and they point to the ICC's desegregation ruling as evidence of the freedom rides' direct impact. They argue that without the freedom rides, the federal government might have continued to just drag its feet.
But there are other perspectives too, right? Like, what about the radical school of thought?
Right. Historians like Claiborne Carson view the freedom rides as a more radical departure from the movement's more traditional reliance on legal battles and appeals to morality. They see CORE's decision to create a crisis as a deliberate strategy to challenge not just the South, but also the federal government and even the more conservative elements within the movement itself.
So from this perspective, the freedom rides represent a more confrontational, a more assertive approach.
Exactly. They were willing to put themselves in harm's way to expose that hypocrisy and force a showdown. They were less concerned about maintaining a respectable image or working within those existing power structures. So this perspective really emphasizes that boldness, the strategic risk-taking of CORE.
And then there's the continuity perspective. How does that view fit in?
Right. Historians like Adam Fairclough, who emphasize continuity, point to the fact that CORE had been employing these direct action tactics for years. They argue that the freedom rides weren't like a radical departure, but rather a continuation of CORE's commitment to challenging segregation.
So they see the freedom rides as part of a longer historical trajectory.
Precisely. They emphasize the deep roots of these tactics, tracing them back to earlier efforts to challenge segregation in interstate travel in public accommodations. They argue that the freedom rides built upon these previous efforts.
Okay, so that's a really interesting way to think about it. It challenges this idea that the freedom rides were just a sudden, isolated event, and instead places them in this broader historical context.
Exactly. And I think each of these perspectives provides valuable insights into the complexity of the freedom rides. They remind us that there's rarely one definitive interpretation of historical events. The meaning and the significance of events often evolve over time as new evidence emerges. And historians grapple with different questions and frameworks.
And speaking of frameworks, there's also the legalist perspective, right, that focuses on those the Supreme Court decisions.
Yes. Legal scholars like Michael Klarman remind us that the freedom rides weren't happening in this legal vacuum. They built upon a series of landmark Supreme Court decisions that had already declared segregation in interstate travel and bus facilities unconstitutional.
So these earlier legal victories, like Morgan v. Virginia and Boynton v. Virginia, laid the groundwork.
Exactly. They provided the legal basis for challenging segregation in interstate travel. And while the freedom rides were crucial in forcing the government to enforce those rulings, the legalists would argue that the foundation was established in the courts.
Right. It's a reminder that the fight for social justice often involves this combination of legal strategies and grassroots activism. Right? They work in tandem.
Complement and reinforce each other.
So looking back on everything that we've explored today, what do you think is the most enduring legacy of the freedom rides?
For me, it's how they forced America to confront this gap between its ideals and its realities. Here was a nation claiming to be a beacon of freedom and democracy, yet denying basic human rights to its own citizens because of the color of their skin.
And the freedom rides exposed that hypocrisy to the world.
Yes, and they demonstrated the power of ordinary people to challenge injustice, even when facing incredible danger and violence. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and determination can make a difference.
The freedom rides weren't just about buses. They were about human dignity, about that fundamental right to be treated with respect and equality, regardless of race or background.
And their legacy continues to inspire us today. They remind us that change is possible, but it often requires courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the freedom rides, we want to leave you with a final thought. We've explored how the freedom rides expose the contradictions at the heart of American society. But those contradictions still exist today, in different forms. What injustices do you see around you? And how can you be a force for positive change in your own community? The freedom rides teach us that even ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they stand up for what they believe in.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.